As we mentioned in cause lawyering, the number of cause lawyers actually is very small. The percentage of the profession is very small. To have a husband and wife cause lawyering team is probably even smaller. So Sara had a very active role in getting the Silkwood case going in many respects. And in that process, got involved with a certain young, haphazard attorney. So tonight she'll tell us a lot about the rest of the story, Karen Silkwood. So thank you, Sara.
I'm happy to be here with you tonight. I want to just say that in going through this material, it was quite a personal journey to go back and remember not only all of the events and facts that unfolded in this historic case, but to remember all the wonderful people. And there's one thing I want to share with you tonight, is that if you're working on something, it doesn't have to be historic. In the case of Silkwood, it was historic. But if you're working on something major in your life and you're on your path, you're doing what you're here to do, you will be with many other wonderful people, and they will all make it happen. It's like a big, synergistic, fabulous experience. And that's what Silkwood was. And because of all the wonderful people and all the parts that they played and everything that they did that only they could do, it ended up being a major litigative case, educational, organizing, and consciousness-raising project that was not only national but international. And tonight what I wanted to do, Danny is right now in South Dakota, working on a case that we're doing right now, which I'm sure will share more with you about that. It's with the Lakota people, defending their rights, and we've been working there for 5 years now on that case. And what I want to do tonight is share with you other aspects of cause lawyering besides the litigation and investigation. On Thursday, he'll be talking about the investigative, litigative aspects of Silkwood. But tonight, I'm going to talk about other things, and I put some on the board. You see here that in addition to prosecuting and defending and cause lawyering and investigating and exposing, there's organizing and educating. There's changing consciousness and policies and laws. All of these are components to this work. And in the tactics of how to do this, there are identifying allies and alliances, educating and researching, organizing and inspiring people to act, fundraising, litigating, investigating, and changing policy and laws. And all of these things happened in the Karen Silkwood case. And the formula that we sort of evolved collectively is one that we went on to use in every other case, every other major case that we did after that. It all kind of, and this is not true of everyone who does cause lawyering. Not everyone has as complete a sort of holistic approach as we have had, and which is why I think it's really important to share these components with you. First, a little bit about, I will say, how did I get involved in something like this? Right? Because I think it's really important not to think that you have to have gone to Harvard, you have to have 2 degrees from Harvard, or whatever to do these things, because it's just not true. I mean, Danny played a phenomenal role in this case, but there were 35, 40 other people, none of whom have gone to Harvard, who also played very important roles. So for myself, I come from North Dakota, and while I started college, I was very, I was a high achiever. I was totally into doing music and sports and leadership and everything. So I had that sort of North Dakota work ethic, which has been extremely important in this work, because it's a lot of work and it doesn't pay well. So, you have to do this kind of work. You have to be motivated internally. And it's really a motivation of service. That's the primary motivation, is you would rather spend your life in service to the larger collective of people than spend your life figuring out how you're going to make a lot of money. Sometimes it might happen simultaneously, but the intent is an important, it's very important, because otherwise you can't get up every day and do all the things that you have to do if you're not internally driven. And if you are internally driven and you know that you're working with the quantum field, I know this is risky, but you're working with the universe. You're not alone, because the universe does bend towards justice. I believe that was Martin Luther King who said that. And it may be slow, but it does bend towards justice. And when you get into this kind of work, you start to experience how other things happen that you didn't make them happen. They just happen. Other people come forward, other articles get written that you didn't even know were being written, and there's a kind of synergy that occurs that is really exhilarating. And it means that no matter how hard the work is, and no matter how difficult the finances are, and they always are, you are profoundly satisfied, because you're not only doing what's in your heart, you're doing it with a whole bunch of other people who have it in their heart as well. And you're getting support, you're getting a wind at your back when it counts. Not always, but when it counts. So that's sort of an introductory. It comes from being from North Dakota, where we went to Sunday school, and we went to Bible school, and we did all these things, and we learned that we were not alone. And I'm very, very grateful for that, because it has sustained this work for my entire life. Then, what really happened in terms of my consciousness is my family, they were conservative Republicans, not reactionary Republicans, not the kind of Republicans we now see today in the Tea Party, but sort of normal, old-fashioned Republicans. And so I believed, by the time I graduated from high school and went to college, that our country was primarily working in foreign policy for freedom and democracy for other people. But that's what we were doing. We were bringing it to people who didn't have freedom or didn't have democracy, and it was a wonderful thing that we were doing. And I remember the day when this disillusionment process began, and it has gone on for my whole life. I had been to Cornell. I had chosen to go west because I liked the West Coast more than the East Coast, and I went to Berkeley, and I finished at Berkeley. I arrived in 1964 quite by accident. I didn't know what was going on there, and it was amazing. It was amazing. I worked at the bank while I applied, and I got in, and all this stuff was happening. You know, Mario Savio was making his speeches. Everything was happening. It was 1964. And I remember the night that I saw students being pulled out of the administration building because they had gone in and occupied the administration building, gotten into all the files, released information to the other students about what was in the files, and that had to do with the CIA recruiting on campus and different things like that. And I remember seeing them being pulled down the steps and their heads banging as they went down the stairs. And I also remember once the Oakland police, who were very, very, very tough, I guess you'd say maybe a little bit fascist in their whole demeanor, were marching in a big all the way across with their clubs and everything. You know, it had this sort of cadence to it, coming from Oakland towards Berkeley, and we were all, you know, 1,000 of us or more marching with flowers and you know, the whole thing. It was all true. I mean, people really were putting flowers at the end of guns, and as you've seen in the pictures. And then, you know, when the violence started, they were clubbing people. All of this was taking place in the context of the Vietnam War. And it's really hard to communicate what that felt like, to have your friends and brothers and husbands and fathers, even for some people, going away to war and coming back in boxes. And then seeing pictures of, you know, eventually a naked Vietnamese girl running down the street with napalm on her, on fire. You know, it was and the day that I remember realizing that I didn't quite understand what was really happening was early on. I had a friend, he was from Los Angeles. I remember the room we were sitting in, I remember the lighting on the walls. And he said, why do you think we're in Vietnam? I said, well, they're working on freedom and democracy in Asia. He said, no, they're not. They're not, so that's why they're there. And I said, okay, well, why are they there? And he said, well, there are minerals. There are minerals that we need from Vietnam. And they want a foothold there because they're afraid of communism having a foothold in Asia. And, you know, he went on to explain that Ho Chi Minh initially was really interested in our Constitution and wanted a copy of our Constitution, you know, before we started bombing the heck out of them and dividing their country in half and doing all these things, putting up phony leaders. And it was really disturbing to, now maybe this happened to some of you with Occupy and with the recent financial crash. You know, maybe some of the people in your generation thought, wow, I'm going to go be an investment banker. I'm going to study. You know, we know that people in the Ivy Leagues were doing that. We've been told this by students. That there's so many of their people were preparing to go and become investment bankers and stuff. Well, what happened to the young people who went to become investment bankers and then realized that they were running the country right down the tube, that they were taking us over a cliff and didn't seem to care at all? That is disillusionment. To find out that what you thought was going on is not what's really going on. And so that was happening to lots of us at that time. And so what happened is, for many of us, we kind of went from being conservative, Republican types or whatever, over to being progressive, just like that. Because there wasn't any middle ground for us. It wasn't a sort of moderate thing or a liberal thing. It was, wait a minute, this is really wrong. We've got to do something about it. Period. You know, so that was going on, and in the context of that, thousands and thousands and thousands of young people started looking at different aspects of it. And over time, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of 501c3s created. All kinds of nonprofits created, not only for peace and for racism and for the environment, but for every different issue. The women's issue, the gay issue, everything, you know, people were just involved in creating different kinds of nonprofit efforts where they could do research and action and educate and organize with people. But it really, it originally stemmed from the Vietnam War and the injustice of it. And it became so obvious that we were being lied to and that it was so unjust what was being done. These people, I mean, why were we in their country? So far away, dropping all these bombs and napalming people and having assassination programs, and it did not make any sense. And it didn't make any sense to me either the night that we had our shock and awe in Iraq. I don't know if any of you remember that. I'll never forget it. Sitting in the living room watching the television and watching the unfolding of the American program called Shock and Awe, where we bombed the heck out of Baghdad and places in Iraq, and they lost their water systems and their electrical systems, and when we left, they still didn't have these systems rebuilt. So, there are just other ways of having foreign policy. There are other ways of changing things in the world and supporting ways to improve the human condition. There are other ways. And if there's one thing I want to sort of start tonight with, is to say, we all have choices. You are not victims. None of us are victims. We're all, sentient beings. We have minds, hearts. We have consciousness, and consciences. We are sentient beings, and every policy that exists right now was put together by people. Every institution was assembled by people. Everything that has been assembled can be reassembled. Every policy can be changed if we want to change it. We are not victims. And we're only victims if we don't want to take the time to figure it out. Do the research. Okay, now what is this thing anyway, and how did it get put together? What's really happening? Who are the people behind it? And because they all, as Danny says, get out of bed every morning and put their pants on one leg at a time, just like we do. So there's no great mystery going on that we can't handle. But in order to do it, we do have to work together. We have to work together, and we have to decide that we're going to bring into being the kind of world, institutions, policies, laws that we know would be best, or that we think would be best for the human family. All right, so after going to school at Berkeley and graduating in anthropology, I started working with American Documentary Films. And that was the first nonprofit film company in the United States. They were making films about Vietnam and about the civil rights movement, and they were also distributing them all over the country. So all of the big moratoriums and marches and everything, people would rent a film from us, and they would distribute it to 3 or 4 people in the course of a day and evening, because they didn't always have good speakers, and so the film would provide that educational tool for them while they were organizing and marching and all this stuff. And we were distributing to everyone, students, women's groups, church groups, everyone who was interested, involved, and active, we were distributing films to, and all over the country. And after that, I worked with one of those people. The two of us started community access television productions here in Santa Cruz in the early 70s, and for 3 years we did community access TV, where we interviewed people and got them on television, people who would normally never get on television. So we were really a voice of the people. And it was through that project, and we were doing news 3 nights a week. It was fun. It was really fun. And editing all night long, and trying to patch sound together when we didn't have the most evolved equipment. It was fun, and we got a lot of information out that wouldn't have gotten out otherwise. Through that project, a woman here, a feminist in town, because I by that time was involved in various feminist things in this area, she provided the money for me to go to Chicago, because they were going to have, in the early 70s, a big conference for the Coalition of Labor Union Women. It was going to be their founding conference. This was the first time that union women had ever come together to talk about their needs and problems as women inside the union movement. So it was, by this time, NOW was very active, and there were all these things going on, but the union women had never done this. And I had, tried to organize. In fact, I did organize a union when I was a waitress. And so I had some experience with this, so I took the camera and I went to Chicago and captured this conference. Really, I don't know how I did it, because I only had one camera, but I got the spirit of it through the course of the interviews and all the footage. And when I came back, we put it together, and there were some very important people. I mean, they thought they were going to have 1,000 people. They had 3,400 people. It was just a huge success and became a very big national story and all this, so I had the footage on it. Right, so we put it together, and we wanted to turn it into a film because, you know, in the early 70s, it wasn't quite at the point yet where everybody had videos in their houses. It was still, we were still thinking film was the way that you had to communicate. And so we took the rough cut video, we went to the East Coast to try to raise money to turn it into a film. And when we got there, we ended up going all down the East Coast corridor, showing this to lots of religious organizations, the Methodist women's groups, the NOW headquarters in New York, the AFL-CIO headquarters in Washington, D.C. Like, there must have been 60 or so different groups that we showed this to while we were appealing for help to convert it to a film, so it could be an organizing tool for working women. Because you know, what our position was, and different people had different positions, ours was, we will never deal with the problem of equal pay for work of equal value without collective bargaining agreements. That's how it's always been done. I mean, with women, our position was, look, women have got to have the benefits that come with collective bargaining agreements, and they're not being organized in their workplaces in the same way, particularly the clerical workers and stuff like that. So we thought, well, good, this video will help sort of spread the word and help them understand that this is something they need to look at. But what came of it was a letter came in the mail from the National Organization for Women asking me to be the chair of their labor committee for the National Organization for Women. I mean, this was not a thought in my head, right? It just kind of came. And so I knew that it was really important, even though I wasn't sure how to do it exactly. But this is what was happening at that time, and people were just doing things whether they knew how or not. They were just, okay, throw me the ball, I'll take this ball, I'm not sure where I'll go with it, but I'm going, you know, and that's what everyone was doing. It was really a very inspired times. So I said yes, and we put together a committee, and they were working on different issues, like we had a couple of boycotts that we were supporting. We were supporting organizing for clerical workers. There were different things. We had some actual practical organizing technique things going on with unions where they were teaching women how to organize, and some, you know, ways into this, a few months into this, in 1975, Kitty Tucker called and said she wanted to come to see me, and she was from the NOW chapter in Washington, D.C. And she said, look, I've got this problem that I'm aware of, and I want to talk to you, and they told me to go see you because you're involved with labor issues. So she came over, and she had a petition that she had designed. It was for supporters of Silkwood. And she was circulating this petition in the anti-nuke movement. And she and her husband were environmentalists, as well as she was a feminist. And she said, look, this woman was working in a plutonium factory down in Oklahoma. And there's only one plutonium factory. It's in Oklahoma. She was working there. And she was contaminated several times by high levels of plutonium, which the half-life, she told me, of plutonium is 25,000 years, which means it's toxic for 250,000 years. And a fiendishly toxic substance, radioactive. And that her house was contaminated, and the food on her refrigerator was contaminated, in her refrigerator was contaminated. And that she was doing an investigation with the union, and her document, she was run off the road the night that she was delivering her documents to a New York Times reporter. She was run off the road and killed, and all of her documents disappeared. I was like, whoa. I didn't know anything about nuclear. Nothing. I mean, I knew I was worried about us having a nuclear war, and at the end of Danny's last talk when he was talking about the whole Bay of Pigs, how close we got to nuclear war. We were all aware of that. But this was nuclear power. And I was not aware of the dangers of radioactive exposure from nuclear power plants to workers and the public. And I did not know about what we all call now national security components. And this whole thing was in the world of national security, because there is a direct link between nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants. Because the power plants actually produce the substance that is used to make. And whether it's plutonium or uranium. And so anyway, she made a great case. She was going to go to law school, and she was very persuasive. And I was like, oh my gosh. Okay, so I said, I'll take your material, because she had a Ms. Magazine article, Rolling Stone, 2 or 3 New York Times articles, and her petition and stuff. I said, I'll get back to you. And it wasn't until about 2 in the morning that I had a chance to look at it. And I thought, oh my gosh. Because as I read all the material, I became increasingly convinced that somebody killed her. And also that to take this on would be dangerous. And also that Now might not want to do this. Because I was not aware of them having taken any position on the issue of nuclear power or weapons, for that matter, although they tended to be in favor of peace. But so I was thinking, oh, this could be an organizing challenge. But at that moment, I was absolutely certain that Karen was in the room. Like, about right here, I was leaning up against the wall reading, and it was kind of like right there, and I was right here. And there wasn't any doubt in my mind. And I had never had that experience before with anybody else. So I was just really quiet. And what I realized is, it was very clear to me. It was if the women don't do something about this, nobody's going to. That was really kind of the message that I was hearing from her. And so the next morning, that's why in the books, I don't know if you've seen this in what you've read, it's in the Cohen book, which I was reviewing myself, this one here. Sometimes when people would ask me, well, why did you do this? And then I would say, because she asked me to. Because that's really what it was for me. That's what the experience was. And so the next morning, I just kind of got everybody together. Okay, we're going to have this major other project that's going to start here. And we worked on our educational materials and our allies and our organizing stuff that we were already doing inside of Now. We started incorporating Silkwood into that. And the magazine that we were developing for the next conference that was coming had her picture on the front. And we started putting research and information into that magazine about this project, along with everything else we were doing. Because in order for this to work, we were going to have to enlist the support, not only of the Now leadership, but of all the chapters in the country, or as many as possible. And they were very active at this point in history. They were having press conferences all the time. There were actions going on. There was stuff happening all the time out there. And so we went forward, Kitty and I went forward. She was focusing on the anti-nuke community and getting her petitions distributed through there, and she was able to get them, for the first time in history, to agree that they would do something in unison. Because they were all local groups. There was the Clamshell Alliance up in the Boston area. There was a group down in the Savannah, Georgia area where there was a big plant. There was Diablo Canyon in California. There were local anti-nuke groups all over the country that formed around plants that existed in their communities. But they had never done anything in unison before. And they said, okay, we have decided that we will, on November 13th, because she was killed on November 13th, 1974, we will do something all together in honor of her. And so that happened. And we began to get the kind of positive feedback inside of Now. And both Kitty and I don't know, I must have given 1,000 speeches about Karen Silkwood. Just telling the story of what happened to her, which I know you've read in your reading. The story of what kind of a person she was, that she'd been to college, she had a science background, she was strong, she was spunky. So when she went into work at the plant and began to discover how many safety hazards were going on and how many people were getting contaminated over and over and over again, and nobody was doing anything about it. And I mean, one time she opened up this drawer and here were all these uranium pellets just laying around in there, which, you know, could have become overheated because they were all together. She discovered that some uranium pellets were being taken home and kids were being allowed to play with them because they were like, oh, look at what I have at my work, look, you can play with it. I mean, which is ridiculous because they're radioactive, and that, you know, people were getting it in their noses and getting contaminated and having to be scrubbed down with Clorox and Tide, but no one was telling the workers that it could give them cancer. That a tiny speck that you can't even see, lodged in the right cell at the right time, would result in cancer. And that many of these people were probably, the ones that had been contaminated several times, kind of married to cancer over time. And that there had been no discussion about that whatsoever with the workers by the Kerr-McGee Corporation, which is the one that owned this plant. And Kerr was a huge senator in Washington, D.C., tremendous amount of power. And so the whole state was kind of beholden to the Kerr-McGee conglomerate in the state of Oklahoma. And you know, nobody really thought that there was anything wrong here. They were providing jobs. And everyone was lucky to have a job, and so there were some problems. So what? And so she encountered a lot of ignorance and a lot of safety hazards and eventually became involved in the union as a way to deal with that. And as she became more and more active and began to talk with Tony Mazzocchi in Washington, D.C., who was the legislative rep for that local down there, they realized that they better get some experts in there, so they sent in 2 professors to meet with the workers and explain to the workers just what plutonium is and just how toxic it is and how dangerous it is, and they were really kind of shocked. And some of them were frightened because they'd had enough contamination that they now realized they could be in danger. And so that was one step in the union process, because the company was trying to, what you call, decertify the union, trying to have a vote and in hopes that the workers would vote to get rid of the union rather than to keep it. And so Karen and Mazzocchi and Vodka and the Tice and these people that were working on the union were trying to develop the health and safety information to the point where it would help the workers decide to keep the union, because without it they wouldn't have any health and safety protection. So there was this kind of struggle going on at that time, and she just kept stepping up to the plate and saying, I know what to do, I'll get the information, I'll do the research, I can find this. And she started becoming like a sleuth inside the plant and going into files and staying late at night and gathering data and getting photographs and looking at x-rays and slowly, you know, figuring out that they were falsifying their records, that there was a lot of sloppiness, that there was, you know, tremendous amount of hazards and stuff, and she was keeping all these records and these lists and all this and giving them to Mazzocchi so that he would be able to figure out what to do about it. And of course, it became noticeable to management that eventually became noticeable that she was doing this. And she became aware that they were aware, she could tell, you know, and so it began to be, it was dangerous and she knew it. Then, all of a sudden this thing happened. I'm telling you, for those of you who may not have read what you were assigned this time, one day, she walked out of the plant and the burr went off and she was contaminated. Right? She had way too much way too much radioactive material on her. So they took her aside and they put her through the scrubbing thing with the Clorox and the Tide and the brushes and all this. And she went home. And then the next day, when she came in, it happened again. The bells all went off and they da-da-da-da-da, which means that she was coming in that way. And then they scrubbed, and then it happened again. So at this point, because by this time they had met with the professors, they knew how dangerous this is. At this point, she's really freaking out because she knows that she's been contaminated a lot in the last 48 hours. And they go to her house and with their Geiger counters and their suits and everything like that, and they go in and the highest levels are, well, they're all over the house, but the highest levels are on the food in the refrigerator. They're 400,000 disintegrations per minute of radiation on the sandwich meat in the refrigerator. That's a lot. That would be the equivalent of about 4,000 bullets from one sniper. That was, I think, the example that Howard Cohen used. If you were to compare it to some other field, to know how dangerous that much plutonium was, it was like about 4,000 bullets, sniper bullets all at once. And so she at that point knew somebody put it there. Because there's no way. I mean, she didn't do it, and they were saying, oh, well, she contaminated herself in order to cause a ruckus, and she's just trying to do things to be dramatic and to help the union and all this, but that wasn't true. And so she knew that someone was after her. In the meantime, there was going to be a meeting with the New York Times, and she was going to bring her list and all of her documents and her x-rays and whatever she had accumulated and give it to the New York Times reporter who was coming down. Mizaki was making the arrangement. And she was looking forward to being able to end this because it was getting really dangerous. And that night that she was supposed to deliver the documents, she met with other union members at the Hub Cafe. She had a manila folder with her. She said to other workers there, I have the goods on them. I hope they go to jail, some of them. And I've got it. So everybody knew she had it. She got in the car, she headed down the road, and after about, 8-10 miles, she had this accident, this lethal accident, where her car went off the road, went along the side of the road for quite a while until it hit a culvert. There were actually two culverts there, and it bounced off one and onto the other, and she was killed. And later, because Mizaki or not Mizaki, but Steve Wadka and her boyfriend Drew and David Byrne from the New York Times were all waiting for her. And it was like, oh, why isn't she here? Why isn't she here? And so finally the phone rang and someone said that she'd been killed. So they flew into action and went to try to find the car, find her, find any information, find the documents. And there were no documents. Karen either. And in fact, later it came out in the trial, much later, that they had taken all the organs out of her body. And they had whisked her away and taken out her brain and liver and lungs and everything. And they accidentally exposed that fact during the trial that they had done this. And that's why no one could find her. When they did find her, she was in the morgue under Jane Doe with no name. That's how they re-entered her into the system. And so what really happened, but I'm not going to go much into this because Danny's going to talk about the investigation and the unfolding of the evidence. But what really happened that night is that she was hit by someone in the rear of her car. We didn't actually know who at this point. And it bounced her over here, and she went along the highway. And the reason she didn't get back up on the highway is because they were right beside her. And so she couldn't get back up. And so she then hit the culvert. And they were trying to get the documents, and probably didn't intend for her to hit the culvert, but it was there. And but we didn't know that. I mean, all we knew is that Mazaki brought in an investigator from Texas who was a crash investigator, and he did this big analysis and everything. And he said, uh-oh, there was a dent in the back of her car that did not have any evidence in it that indicated that it had come from the accident, you know, from being banged up against the culvert or this or that. It was done on the highway. And he said, this right here is the dent that knocked her off the road. And and he'd done hundreds and hundreds of accident analysis things. And so we knew that, and we also knew that, because we all saw this on television, that the state of Oklahoma's highway department quickly came and repaved the whole highway so that you couldn't do any more investigative, and dragged the sides of the road and all this stuff. You know, that happened very quickly, so it was like, oh. But fortunately, Pipkin did his investigation before that happened. And so at the stage that we were at in 1975, because she was killed in 74, in November 13, 74, 75, all we knew is her documents disappeared, her house was contaminated with hundreds of thousands of disintegrations per minute of radiation, and she's dead. And how did this all happen to her? And why is there an immediate cover-up going on about everywhere you look to investigate? There's a cover-up here or a cover-up there. So what we did is we targeted, these are all kind of things to help you with the whole issue of organizing. What we decided is we would dovetail with Women Against Violence Against Women Day, and because we would make this an issue for the Now chapters, that we were against the kind of violence that happened to Karen Silkwood. And that if we're asking women to be courageous and become leaders in their unions, and she was the leader for health and safety, and they get killed, then the women's movement has a responsibility to stand up and support her and ask for an investigation so we can find out what happened to her. And so that's what we did, and we put all these materials together and sent them out to all the chapters in Now. And on that day, in the summer of 1975, this is a day when all the press is out finding out what women have to say. And our president of Now was with us, and 4 of us went to see the Attorney General, but of course he didn't show up. But the FBI investigator that coordinated their investigation and all that was there. And we sat down with them and we said, okay, she was contaminated, she was collecting evidence, all her documents disappeared, she was run off the road, and she is dead. Could you please tell us what's happened in your investigation over the last 6 months? Can you tell us what happened to her? And they said, well, we don't know. And at one point, they said, you know, it's not like you can go and find the candlestick maker in every library. You know, that you can solve the mystery every time. Oh, it was the candlestick guy in the library, or whatever that thing is. You know, the British. So it doesn't work like that in real life, girlies. You know, so we've closed this investigation, we don't know the answers to your questions, and you should go home and be quiet, basically. I mean, it was very patronizing. Okay, so we were mad. We got up, we went out the door, and Now had organized press. It was because the president was with us, Karen Silkwood. We open up the door, and oh my gosh, there's cameras everywhere. Just press everywhere, all across these steps, right? And you know, we're all talking, and I charged them with a cover-up, with the cover-up of this murder and this disappearance of the documents and the evidence and everything else. And it ends up all over the United States because we had a press clipping service, and these boxes started coming in because the AP story went out all over the United States and saying, Nelson charges cover-up of the FBI cover-up. I had no idea that was going to happen, right? I just went out and said it, but I didn't know that it was going to go out everywhere. And there were literally boxes of press clippings. And at the same time, the Now chapters, who are just great, they had taken up the cause, and everywhere across the country, in all of their local actions, they had information about her, they had pictures of her, and they were getting the petitions signed, and all of these letters and petitions were going to the Congress demanding an investigation. So, it worked. I mean, we had to go through several other steps. We had to get other allies with us. Nader came, the UAW labor group came, CLU, Coalition of Labor Union, had a representative, another leader of Now, Ellie Smeal. They all came with us to see Senator Ribikoff in the Senate, and he and Metcalf were, having an audience with us, and we and our allies were all saying, we need an investigation of this case. There's something really wrong, the FBI didn't do their job, blah, blah, blah. And they said yes. They said yes, and a large part of the reason why they said yes is because of the pressure that had been generated from the grassroots all over the country. And all the handwritten letters and everything that had come pouring in, particularly from the districts of Metcalf and Ribikoff and Dingell and some of these guys that were really important in the congressional investigation. So they said, we were flabbergasted actually, that it actually had worked. I mean, because we were all, working around the clock, not knowing if anything was ever going to work. And so then there were 2 hearings. And by this time, I just need to say to you that there were real constituencies in alliance. Because I put up here that alliances and allies are so important if you're trying to deal with a major issue of injustice. So we had labor, we had the feminists, we were soon to have the Jesuits as Danny came in. We had the Quixote Center, which is a Catholic Justice Center. We had the Environmental Policy Center because Kitty's husband was working there, and he was doing all kinds of environmental research and working with different congressional offices on it. We had the anti-nuke movement, and eventually we had musicians and artists who were working with us, raising money and helping to get the word out through their own artistic channels. And so all of that pressure helped get this thing to kick over into a congressional investigation. And I would just say there were 2 hearings. The most important things that happened, in those hearings. The first one was that a woman named Jackie Saruji emerged. This Pete Stockton, who was an investigator for the Congress, did a great investigative job. And in the course of him doing all this work, he ran into this woman, Jackie Saruji, who was a reporter for the Nashville, Tennessean newspaper down in Nashville, Tennessee. And she was writing a book about nuclear power, being published by Aurora Publishing. And when she was talking to Stockton, she was clearly trying to convince Stockton that Karen was a creep, that she smoked marijuana, that she went to bed with more than one guy in the course of a year, that, she was, blah, blah, blah. It was, they were always trying to discredit her, right? And so Stockton was like, I don't care about her personal life. I'm trying to figure out what happened to her. And how do you know this anyway? And she said, well, I have all these FBI documents. Oh, really? Because he couldn't get any documents from the FBI, and he was working for the Congress. So he said, really? How many do you have? He said, 1,000 pages. She said, 1,000 pages. And she was going to reach into her purse for them. And he said, oh, no, never mind. That's okay. Would you like to testify? So he had her come and testify at the first hearings. In the meantime, he, and it was really a trap. And when she started to testify, after we had all testified about the history of our efforts and whatever, she started to testify and she started saying all this stuff. And it was really making Dingell mad, who was was the congressperson working on this, because it was clear that she had some special access to all this information from the FBI, and that she had all these documents, and she had copies of them for herself, and all this. So what happened was she got exposed as the first COINTELPRO reporter in the history of the country. Everyone knew they existed. These are reporters that look like reporters, but they're really working for the CIA, FBI, other agencies, and they're gathering information for them behind the color of their reporter credentials. So they can go out and sit down with people and talk with people and find out things, because the person thinks they're talking to a reporter, but they're talking to someone who's gathering information. And so it was a big Time magazine article. This was a huge deal because as the reporting community was very interested in who she was and what the deal was. It was a big story. So, and she got fired from the Nashville, Tennessee. And so then what happens is the guy, Siegenthaler, famous man who runs the Nashville, Tennessee newspaper, he was famous in the civil rights stuff, and he had been sent by the Kennedys down to participate in certain activities when they were trying to get the violence to stop and what have you. So Siegenthaler sat down with her and she explained everything to him and he fired her. And then there was this big rumor campaign that Siegenthaler went to bed with little girls. And so it was an attack on him. And of course it wasn't true, but it was a rumor campaign that started to discredit him. And so then in the next set of hearings, he testified. He was very angry about what was happening to him. And it was considered to be another FBI effort. And so he testified, and his wife was very upset. She was there too. They were making innuendos about her as well. And so then the next thing like that happened was that Dingell was really mad at the FBI now, and he gave them until June 14th to get all the documents to him. Everything that Saruji had and everything else that they had, he wanted on Silkwood. He wanted everything by June 14th or else. And what happened in the week of June 14th is a prostitute who had been arrested on April 25th, which was one day before the first hearing, which happened on April 26th. On April 25th, in Dingell's district, he's a congressperson, a prostitute was arrested. Her name was Herman, I think. They kept her for 2 months, and then on the week of June 14th, out she comes telling the press that Dingell is one of her special customers. And again, the reporters that were working out there for us, with us, said that she had FBI connections. So Dingell didn't do the third hearing. There was going to be a third hearing, and he canceled it. It was at that moment in time that we realized we're going to have to find a lawyer, because the Congress is just not going to, they're just not going to go all the way with this. We still don't know who did this to her or how it happened. So in the process then of looking for an attorney, that's when we began to realize the issue of fundraising. Because the first attorney we met with said he needed $40,000 up front or he wouldn't do anything. And I was like, oh, wow. This is going to be, oh. So then we were told about Danny, who was working with the Jesuits, and he was not working as a private attorney, and he said, we went to him because time was running out. The statute of limitations was running out in the fall of 1976, and we were now, or 1976. And we were now in 1976, because the hearings happened in 1976. I don't know if I got there right before, but it's 76. So here we are, we're a few months away from that, we've got to do something. He said, I'll file them for you. I'll file this. And so he became part of this team, and it was just amazing because he brought not only his incredible constitutional ability and knowledge about how to craft something like this. But he also brought investigators, because when he had worked for F. Lee Bailey, he had met all of, as you know from the previous things he's talked about, he had met all these private investigators, and he was friends with them. So even though they never worked for nonprofits, in this case, they did. You know, and so they came in different ones at different times to help us get information. And when, you know, on Thursday, he'll share some of that unfolding information that happened. It's quite dramatic, actually, what happened in the investigation, and how significant, how much bigger this was than we realized. What the connections that this had to other things that were going on in the country. But I'm going to jump ahead, I'm going to jump over the investigation and go to other kinds of organizing and education things that happened in this case, because he may not touch on these things. One was, during the trial, we had allies out in Oklahoma. We were doing a trial in Oklahoma. It was very big in 1979. Big, long trial. Amazing things happened in this trial, all in our favor. I mean, the other side was just like a waterfall was falling on them. They just, every day it got worse for them. Because they were lying. You know, and if you go into the courtroom and you're lying, and plus we had all this evidence, and Jerry Spence was working with us, another brilliant trial lawyer. And but during that period of time, trial preparation and trial, some of our other allies started working on shutting down a nuclear project that was starting in Oklahoma called Black Fox. Actually, the Native American word for this area where they were going to put a big plant was mutated fox, which is, you get mutations with radiation. It was interesting that that was the original Native American word for that area. But anyway, all of our people that were involved in that, most of us were too involved in the litigation investigation, but then there were many others that were involved in that, and they went there and they chained themselves to the bulldozers, because the bulldozers were preparing the ground to build this big nuclear thing there, and they got these big carborundum chains, and they chained themselves to the bulldozers, and there was no way for them to do the bulldozers without cutting these things, which was very, very difficult to do because of the nature of the chains. And all the time that the police and everybody were trying to get them out of these chains, the organizers were educating them about nuclear power, nuclear radiation, nuclear weapons, the relationship between these things, and the dangers to the people that would live there. And by the time they finally got them out of the chains, pretty much everybody was on their side. And when they went to court, they convinced everybody in the court that this was a horrible thing for the people in Oklahoma to have this built right there, because they had enough research, they had enough research and materials and educational materials that they put together so that they could do that. They could explain it to people in a way that would help them understand. And they stopped that. They won that, and it was not done. It was stopped. And another thing I wanted to share with you that came after the trial, which was trial was very big, and the victory was announced. They announced it in the middle of the soap operas. They broke into the soap operas to announce the Silkwood victory because it had so many legal precedents that were set. Changing the law, changing policy. Many policies and laws were changed in the Silkwood victory. And as a result of that, no more nuclear plants were ordered since 1979 until a month or so ago. That whole period, no plants were ordered because the liability for accidents was set so high that the insurance companies didn't want to insure them. And the only way around that is to make us pay instead of the insurance companies. And that's been one of the big right-wing efforts in recent times, is to get that liability transferred over to the public. So if there's a $30 million or billion accident, we'll pay for it. And so now it's possible to consider building them again. But anyway, what came afterwards was another major education and organizing thing. In the fundraising effort, we had started a direct mail campaign, and we were mailing to lists of people in the mail every 2 months or so, and building a list of people who cared about this issue and were sending money to support this effort, because the investigators had to be paid, there were all kinds of legal costs, there were deposition costs, all kinds of stuff involved in taking this all the way to the trial. And so we had a direct mail campaign going, and we had concerts that were being done by Jackson Browne and Bonnie Raitt and Crosby, Stills and Nash and other musicians that supported this effort. And so they would do concerts, and then that would educate the people who came to the concerts, and it would also raise money which they would contribute to the cause. And what happened after the trial was really interesting. They started something called MUSe, Musicians United for Safe Energy. And they decided they would have a production company, and they would have like a foundation. And I was on the board of the foundation, and there were a lot of musicians and production people on the production board, and there were many other people on the foundation board. And the idea was to have 3 nights in Madison Square Garden with lots of artists and raise lots of money, and then have the foundation board distribute that to anti-nuke groups, to safe energy groups that were working on alternative energy, solar, and other things. And so all of the groups in the safe energy and anti-nuke groups were sending in their proposals. And we had this humongously successful 3 days in Madison Square Garden with lots and lots of artists participating. And it was incredible, and that it was a record made, and the record had all this educational material associated with it, so you could read all about everything. And then, you know, we looked at all the proposals and figured out how to divvy up all this money among all the groups that were working on different aspects of solving these problems. So, so it continued, the organizing and education aspects of this continued afterwards. And what I would say in conclusion about this component of the project, these components of the project, is Karen Silkwood became the first nuclear martyr ever of the United States and Europe. Both Australia and Europe, we had calls coming in all the time from these other countries, but everyone understood that's who she was. And that was because of all the educating and organizing and speaking and everything that everybody was doing, and because we had reporters with us. We had, from the beginning, Ms. Magazine, NPR. There was a woman in NPR who, she's the one that figured out, by calling Westinghouse, that was in charge of the fast breeder reactor where the plutonium fuel rods were going and were being produced at Karen's plant. They were going to this fast breeder, and that they were missing 40 pounds of bomb-grade plutonium in these rods. They were missing pellets. And it was Barbara from NPR that figured that piece out. And we think that part of the documents, in fact, we're sure that part of the documents that she was delivering that night had to do with the MUF, misaccounted for materials. And you know, Danny later found out what that was all about, but at the time that we were doing, all we knew was that they were missing, but we didn't know why. And so the reporters were really important. Howard Cohn from the Rolling Stone ended up writing this book. I mean, he just never quit until he finally finished a book. There was another guy who wrote a book, Richard Rashke. There was David Berman, who wrote several articles in the New York Times. This whole constituency of reporters was also extremely important in terms of getting the word out. And then finally, there was a point where we had a team of 2 executive producers from Hollywood, Buzz Hirsch and Larry Kano, came, and they said, hey you guys, like we're really into this issue. And so they hung around with us and they learned everything they could, and they said, we want to make a film about this. And they began putting it together, and they went back to Hollywood, and they eventually got ABC to agree to make a movie that went into the theaters. But in the course of getting to that, the Carnegie Corporation went after them and said that they wanted to have all of their source material. They wanted all their interviews, all their research, everything that they'd gotten from us. They wanted to have access to all of it, and of course we wanted it to prepare for trial. We didn't want to give it to Carnegie. And so Danny's work on the Caldwell case, which established newspaper person's privilege, if you recall, because he's talked about that already, well, that body of law then, they said, okay, it applies to filmmakers as well. I mean, that was the legal position taken by these 2 filmmakers, which they learned how to do that from Danny, and they got support from people in Hollywood that were big artists and stuff that gave them money for their legal effort, and they won. So that protection for their sources was established for the first time ever for filmmakers in the course of this case. Then they went on to get the deal with ABC, and one of the great things about ABC being the people to make the movie is that they had a television network to promote it. So they had Meryl Streep, Cher, Mike Nichols was the director, and they had it on television all the time that this movie Silkwood was coming out, and it was going to be really important and what have you. And it was the first, maybe the only, I think it might be the only, what they call message film, which is a film that is done to educate people about a big problem. The only message film that has ever been financially successful in Hollywood. Because people are always afraid to make them, and they make them, but they make them realizing they probably won't make any money. But Silkwood did make money. It made money in the United States, and it also made money in Europe as a video. So that was another major contribution to the fact that so many people knew who she was, and considered her the first nuclear martyr. So anyway, that's that part of the cause lawyering. And I can just say to you that if you're inspired to do this kind of work, you'll never regret it. You'll never regret it, because the world, for whatever reason, there are different theories about this, but we do have a situation where people behave badly. There are a lot of people. They behave badly, they make bad choices, and they can be very, very selfish, and they can hurt a lot of people. And the only answer to that is for other people to stand up for something else and to represent a better solution, or a more compassionate one, or a more even practical one. And so I just hope that you will all decide to be in that camp, sort of. And there's many groups in there. It's not just them and us and all that. There's all kinds of constituencies in there, but I do hope that you'll be on the side of goodness. I can't believe it. I think we're on time. Yeah, does anyone have questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What happened to all of the people who were contaminated? It seems like they really got shafted in all of this.
They did. And I don't know over the years what has happened to them in terms of their health. But that would be a good thing for us to do as a research project. That's a really good research project. Because sometimes it takes 10, 20 years for people to get sick. And that would be an important one. And I don't know the answer to that.
I was gonna say, so when you took on the Silkwood case, it seems like it slowly turned into a kind of an anti-nuclear power case, and I can understand like a lot of the points of that also. But do you feel that like nuclear power is never really gonna be a viable option in the world?
The problem with it is, there's two really big problems. And Danny will be able to give you more information than I have tonight, because he's going to go into the investigation. But in the course of the Silkwood project, it became so obvious that the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, which is now the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is the government agency, was not telling the truth most of the time, right? So if you have enough of that experience, you start to realize that they don't have our health and safety as the priority. They have other things as the priority. So there's a real lack of trust that anyone who's worked in this area, in this arena, in this field has. There's a revolving door, so that the corporate guys come out and go into the government agency, work in there for a while, come out, go back into the corporation. It's one hand washes the other all the time. So there's a serious problem there because it's so dangerous, this thing. But then more importantly and central to everything is they don't have any solution for the waste. If they had a solution for the waste, we could all just like celebrate and have a whole new conversation. But they don't. And so for them to start again to build these plants, because what you have to realize is they had all these plants around the country, but they stopped building them after the trial, but still they had them all over the place. I've forgotten 110 of them, or I don't know how many. And every one of those was producing waste every day. And the waste was uranium, or in the case of the fast breeder, it was plutonium. And that waste they were putting into these containers, which couldn't hold it. It would start leaking out because the containers were not strong enough for this toxic stuff. After a while, they leak. Then it goes down in the ground and gets in the water supplies, like up in the Hanford, Washington area. And all over, wherever there were the plants, there were these leaking containers of all the waste. And then they filled it all up. So then they wanted to, let's put it in Yucca Mountain in Nevada. They wanted to find some other place where they could take all these containers and stick them inside the mountain, and hopefully they'd be okay there for the next, 100,000 years. I mean, think about it. You have to protect something for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I mean, what kind of a solution is that to our energy problems? So, I mean, people were trying to figure out, how do you get the human culture to protect something that dangerous that long? And what if you have earthquakes and calamities that you can't really predict, and it gets out into the environment and into the water and into the ocean, because there are plants along the ocean and stuff. So there's a lot of these problems, but if you could solve the waste, so you didn't have these leaking containers all over the place. The people in Nevada didn't want it to go into Yucca Mountain. There's an earthquake thing under Yucca Mountain. It was another bad solution, just like there are several earthquake deals around Diablo Canyon, which is one of our plants in California. We have two, Sonanova and Diablo Canyon. They should both not be relicensed, but particularly Diablo Canyon. But the thing is, so they don't have a solution to the waste. And I believe, the last time I looked anyway, the people in Nevada were stopping it at Yucca Mountain. They didn't want everybody's waste going there. And so I don't know why. I guess Obama, he has, I think there's something like 9 or 11 nuclear plants in the state of Illinois, and I think, they're one of his funders. He's more open to nuclear than any other recent Democratic president. But I think it's a mistake, because they don't have a solution to the waste. They might figure it out someday. They might be able to take this radioactive, toxic, scary stuff that lasts for God only knows how long, and and turn it into something useful, but they haven't figured it out yet. And so they lie when they say that everything's going to be okay, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. It's not like Japan. We have it under control. We're more evolved than that. It's just not true. It's just not. When you look at it carefully, we've got all kinds of plants that are in bad shape and old and what have you. Okay, sorry, too long. Yes.
Well, from what I understand, there has been a move to take that nuclear waste and make it into what they call smart bombs and weapons that they have actually already deployed. So that nuclear waste is now, that radioactivity is going out wherever they started.
Out in space?
Weapons. No.
Weapons on
In
Earth.
the Middle East, under Bush, they were using, I don't know, they probably still are, but I know under Bush.
Well, they already do, it's uranium tip, uranium enriched weapons.
He's
Yeah.
referring to completed
Radioactive.
uranium.
Yeah, but they don't use all the waste.
But, right,
No.
that's
But
what
they
they're
do
doing.
use some for weapons.
Which to me is
Yeah.
very wrong.
Yeah.
And also, I think another big issue with nuclear power plants is the issue of nuclear proliferation. You've got those power plants, and you've got grade radioactive material.
You're gonna have the weapons.
You're gonna have weapons,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
So
mean,
as far as I'm concerned, it's an untenable solution already.
well, I guess the thing to say that I would say, I know it sounds, maybe to some of you, like you might sound like, oh, these people are really pie in the sky people. They think that, because we need nuclear power because otherwise we won't have enough power. But I would just urge you to think more about it because we are very creative. I have total faith in the human family to create wonderful solutions to problems, but they have to be funded. The money can't all go to oil and nuclear and us expect to get out of the mess we're in. There really has to be a big investment in the alternatives and in more than one of them. And, and we have to have conservation because we can lower our usage a lot. But we just can't just say, oh, well, they've got the plants already there, so that's what we have to do. If it's going to contaminate potentially, an entire state when they have an accident, you got to rethink it, I think. Yes?
I was wondering, it wasn't entirely clear to me on the reading online what happened with the reimbursement of her family. Because so it started out as 500,000 for punitive and then 10 million for something else, and then it got reduced down to like 5,000, and then they appealed that, and did they then successfully, so it was 1.3, it wasn't the 10 million after that?
Oh, no,
It was
it
1.3.
started out the biggest judgment ever in history against, a corporation. And then it went through this weird appeal process. And Danny can explain this a little better, but I'll do the best I can. We won both appeals. There was a Supreme Court appeal and there was a Circuit Court appeal. The Circuit Court appeal took, I don't know, something like 18 months, the longest ever. They clearly delayed. So that by the time their decisions came, we'd be already out of trial and what have you. But the issues that were being addressed in that Circuit Court hearing related to this whole issue of the money. I'm trying to remember how this worked. Coming out of that Circuit Court, we could have gone back to trial, and we could have gone back to trial probably including the civil rights component, which had been separated out, and we could have gone after even more money than the 10 million. But my recollection is that Bill Silkwood was not really well. He had no interest in doing another climb the mountain kind of thing. And somehow or another, this Circuit Court, it related to workman's comp, or you have to have Danny answer this. There were some issues in there that meant that the amount of money was going to be much lower than the original. You have to ask him. Because it's legal, and I can't remember exactly what it was. It was very disappointing. So was some money taken for trial expenses, and the rest of it went to the kids. Most of it went to the kids, to her children. But it wasn't a lot. You know, I think it was more than, my recollection is it was more than $1 million that went to them. But I'm not positive about that either. But it was one of these deals where we would have to fight all over again in order to keep them from whittling away the money. Somehow they whittled it away. He'll explain it. Any other questions?
Sarah, I was just going to say, it might be interesting to talk a little bit about the money trail behind the Kerr and the corporate, because the whole nuclear issue is so connected to the money trail and who's taking that money and where that's going.
You mean for the industry itself?
Yeah, I mean, why there's so much investment in nuclear is, it's not just about power, it's about behind that, it's the money that people are making from it.
Yes.
Bombs and all kinds of stuff, right?
Well, the thing is that we spent almost 20 years in Washington, so we did see a lot of how there were major disillusionment spots in that process, but there's a lot of money at stake here, and a lot of it comes from the government. And what you see, well, I really saw this in 1980 when Reagan came in. We were there and we saw it. All of a sudden there were these big articles in the newspapers and big ads and big stories and everything about how corporate America, you should come to Washington. This is the future. Come here. And what I now realize was happening is that they knew with this new administration coming in and it's bent towards certain kinds of money things, they could come to the trough in Washington and they could start getting more and more money for their private programs, right? Nuclear gets a lot of money, and oil gets a lot of money, and there are huge lobbying operations. And then all of a sudden, more and more lobbying operations started appearing in Washington. It really changed a lot in the 80s. And where, they were very clear about what they were doing. They were very clear that they were going to take these tax monies and they were going to give them to corporations. That's exactly what happened. We went to the corporate world, which is why Danny sometimes makes a reference to National Socialism, which is what was in Germany, which is really, what that means is, it doesn't mean socialism. It means that you take all the money that the taxpayers pay and you subsidize corporations. That's National Socialism. And that's where the money goes. And if you make the argument, well, we got to do that because they're going to create the jobs. You have to, think again, and do the research. It just isn't true.
Yeah, I'm paraphrasing what you said, but basically you mentioned that without effective means for women to participate in collective bargaining, that the question isn't even going to be asked about equal pay for equal work. I was wondering if you know what steps are being taken today to address this in instances like the case against Walmart and other places where women there's widespread discrimination, but there really isn't an effective means for them to even address the question or seek litigation because of Walmart saying things like we exist in so many different states, we're not the same company in this state as this state because of our localities and all things like that.
Lilly Ledbetter provides for that.
I'm sorry?
The Lilly Ledbetter Act provides for part of that remedy.
Do you know if the National Organization for Women or other organizations, collections of people fundraising, all those types of things, are working to try to assess the status of women in the workplace or to make any advances?
Yes. I don't know the answer to that right now because I've been so involved in our project that I'm not as involved in now as I used to be. So, I pay my money every year, but I'm not as involved in exactly what they're doing. I assume that they are continuing to work on this. The thing that I said was maybe a little bit different, maybe I didn't say it quite the way, is it's not that the issue wouldn't get raised, it's that it's pretty hard to solve it without collective bargaining agreements, without the ability to sit down and negotiate with management. It's very hard to solve some of these economic inequality problems. So I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying there aren't enlightened businesses what I would call enlightened. They have enlightened consciousness, and their policies and programs are such that they're good for the people who work with them as well as for them. There are definitely businesses like that, but there is a greater tendency in because this is a major policy issue. Changing policy and laws. If there is one law and policy that needs to change in this country, it is the issue of corporations, because the corporate they're under the cover of this law that says that the CEO can be fired if he or she makes a decision to do anything that isn't in the interest of the profits. She can get fired. In other words, there's the mandate for the corporation is to produce profits for the stockholders. And they've got to think like that, they've got to make those decisions. They can't do it for the environment, they can't do it for the larger good of the community, they can't take these other things into consideration according to the actual laws. That is a huge target for change.
Along those lines, do you think it would be a good first step for the government to acknowledge that it contracts and does business with a lot of these corporations that take that as their mandate, especially in like private prisons and things like that? Do you think that would be a first step, or would it be just a better way to go about it, looking at that mandate itself as a law?
I think one has to look at that mandate because the thing is that if you're a corporate CEO and you say to me, look, I'm sorry, I'd like to do something different here besides contaminate the whole state or whatever I'm doing, the rivers, the pulp, the paper mills and the rivers and these things, because this is how the environment got contaminated, is through the corporations. And somebody might say, look, I'd love to have clean coal. I'd like to put scrubbers on my things. But, it's really expensive and I don't have the money and I have to follow my guidelines here that I have to produce profits regularly for my stockholders, and I cannot take this money and put it on these scrubbers. So I'm sorry that the mercury is going out. I'm sorry that acid rain is destroying all the fish, which is what happened on the East Coast. I'm really sorry about this, but I've got to do my job. So I feel that, you've got to deal with that. When I say you, guess what, gang? All the forces that we've encountered in these cases, all the forces that are coming up in these cases, they're all still in play. They're not gone. It's just that we know more about them now. But I'm sorry to say that our generation has not completely solved these things. You all are going to inherit this. So that's one of the reasons why we feel so strong. We should share whatever we've learned to help you.
Not saying they're enlightened at all, but somebody at ABC got a little bit of enlightenment.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that at all? Why they made the decision to even do the movie? I mean, given everybody else they're in bed with, that they would even do that. I mean, their two network competitors had investments in the nuclear industry, so they would, the CBS and Westinghouse and NBC.
I think part of it was the amount of evidence that we had. I can't say enough about research and investigation, because when you have the facts, when you figure out what's really happening, when you know when you do the research, when you get the data together, and you can show it to people and say, look here, look. So what Buzz and Larry, the filmmakers, were doing, they were just like gobbling up all of our stuff, and then they were using that to persuade people that something needed to be done about this, and we needed to get the story out. And the story was so powerful in itself that there were just people. It's always people. There were people inside one little part of ABC, not the whole thing. One little part that said, let's do it.
But they had to prove it would make money. So
yeah, well,
that's the best part that you.
I know. It's really a good part that actually was successful. Okay.